Welcome to the second summary video on superpower relations and the Cold War. This one involves just three crises: the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missiles Crisis, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Even though it's just three events, this video will probably be a little bit longer than the first one because there's so much to know about these. So enjoy this video, and as always, let us know if you've got any questions. To explain why the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, you need to look at least a couple of years back. But to be honest, you could look even further back to Stalin's decision to launch the Berlin blockade in 1948 to 1949. He had been motivated by those same two terms at the top, the window to the west and the brain drain. So the window to the west was the idea that West Berlin, deep in the heart of communist East Germany, advertised capitalism to East Berliners and by extension to the rest of East Europe. So you could be a plumber or a doctor in East Berlin and you can do your job and get paid whatever you get paid, then literally walk across the street into West Berlin and see your plumber friend or your doctor friend and see that their quality life was so much better. They got paid more, they could shop at better shops, and you knew deep in your heart that communism wasn't serving you as well as capitalism was serving them. It's not a surprise, therefore, that many Eastern Europeans left East Europe because capitalism could offer them a better quality of life. But if you are in, say, Czechoslovakia, a communist country, you would find it very difficult to walk across the border into Austria without a severely good reason. The Czechoslovakian government and the USSR government would make it very difficult for you to go into a capitalist country without specific visas. But if you're in West Berlin, there was nothing stopping you from going to East Berlin. And if you're in East Berlin, there was nothing stopping you from going to West Berlin. So any Eastern European could find it relatively easy to go to East Berlin, walk over into West Berlin, get on a train, and then go to France or Spain or Britain or wherever you want. As a result, up until 1961, around 4 million Eastern Europeans had left through West Berlin in search of a better life. And again, this runs the full range of jobs such as plumbers or doctors or architects or teachers or whatever you want. The idea is these people are going for a better life in West Europe, but they are hurting the East European economy. So Khrushchev knows that a Berlin blockade wouldn't work. The West would simply offer another airlift. Could last for a month, could last for a decade, but the West has shown that they could do it. As a result, Khrushchev doesn't try to starve out West Berlin, he tries to get the West to leave West Berlin. This is through his ultimatum. In the 1950s, he publicly challenged Britain, America and France to leave their occupied zones of West Berlin or else. There wasn't a clear consequence if they didn't follow through, but it was clear that there would be some kind of military or political consequence because of it. So as a result of this, the president at the time, Eisenhower, needed to come to some sort of agreement. He met with Khrushchev on several occasions, and the two of them got on personally. In other words, they actually were okay in a room together. It wouldn't be like Truman and Stalin, who never spoke to each other face to face after the Potsdam Conference. As a result of this, Khrushchev took away the ultimatum, at least to begin with. They agreed to meet at the Paris Summit in 1960 with other great powers like Britain and France. Unfortunately, a couple of days before the summit or the meeting was due to take place, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. So this is the U-2 spy plane incident. The pilot, the American spy/pilot, a guy by the name of Gary Powers, an amazing spy name, was captured, but the Americans didn't know that he was captured alive. So Eisenhower went on to international television. He publicized to the world saying, the Soviet Union has shot down a weather plane. This was absolutely awful. We weren't doing anything bad. We weren't doing anything untoward. They've shot down an innocent spy plane and killed this innocent person. Unfortunately, Khrushchev and the USSR could prove that it wasn't a weather plane. They publicized Gary Powers and said this is an American spy. The West and America specifically cannot be trusted. So Eisenhower, being caught in this lie, ruined the personal relationship with Khrushchev. The Paris summit collapsed and no agreements were made. A few months later, in 1961, President Kennedy became the new president of America. Now, compared to Eisenhower, who had been one of the most important generals defeating Nazi Germany, Kennedy was this fairly young, fairly inexperienced politician. So Khrushchev realized that he could perhaps intimidate or bully Kennedy a bit more. This was made even clearer after Kennedy's involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion, which we'll look at in a few minutes' time. Now, Khrushchev brought back the ultimatum, thinking that he can intimidate Kennedy into getting the rest of Britain and France to leave West Berlin. But Kennedy realised that he couldn't back down here, otherwise he'd have to back down again and again. So he replied by increasing military spending by $3.5 billion, and a lot of that went to extra troops and extra supplies in West Berlin. The message is very clear. West Berlin is not up for negotiation. We will put extra resources in there to defend it. This was a clear challenge to the Soviet Union. By this point, we're around halfway through 1961. Now, at the start of July 1961, the leader of East Germany, a man called Walter Ulbricht, publicly said no one has any intention of building a wall. He was trying to soothe tensions and soothe people's fears about Berlin being split into two. 13th of August 1961, the wall is built without warning. Now, this isn't the wall that you've probably seen in pictures. It's just a fence and some brick walls at certain parts. But the point is, it's done overnight to prevent hundreds, if not thousands, of East Berliners making a mad dash across the wall. Over the years, the wall is combined with hundreds and thousands of guards, watchtowers, a death strip in between East and West Berlin, which is lit up with floodlights. It's got white sand, so it's easy to see people trying to hide in their footprints. There's mines laid down and spike traps. It's designed to be as dangerous and as unpleasant to cross as possible. So we need to look at what the short-term consequences of this wall were, and then the long-term consequences. So focusing on the East and the Soviet Union in particular, Khrushchev publicly said that the Berlin Wall was guarding the gates of socialist paradise. In other words, the Soviet line, the Soviet propaganda was that the Berlin Wall was designed to keep capitalism out. In other words, protect communism. That's absolute nonsense. Everyone knew it was nonsense because all of the guards were facing inwards. In other words, they were designed to stop the communist people going into the capitalist side. On the west-hand side, Kennedy was a little bit mixed. There are two quotes which would be really useful to learn for him. He would publicly go to West Berlin and give an inspirational speech saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner." In other words, he said, "I am a person of Berlin. Even though this city has been split into two, I will not forget you." He then got onto a plane, flew away, and then never visited Berlin again. In fairness, he was assassinated a couple of years later, but the point is he probably wouldn't have done anything, even if he was president for a full 8 years. In private, he had said a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. So Kennedy will get a lot of criticism, particularly in America, for not standing up to Khrushchev. But this isn't like the Berlin blockade and airlift. In the Berlin blockade, Stalin is starving people out so you can drop in supplies with your airlift. With the Berlin Wall, you cannot shoot that down, you cannot blow it up without escalating tensions. If you were the first person to fire a gun or detonate an explosive, you lose the propaganda war. And Khrushchev, or the Soviet leader, could very rightly say that the West was being the aggressor. So Kennedy's reaction, the second private quote, was probably much more sensible in the long run. The long-term consequences, weirdly, is that it kind of solved the problem of Berlin. It was absolutely awful for East and West Berliners, particularly if you were living on East Berlin and most of your relatives were in West Berlin. There are even stories of children or close relatives who were split up for months, if not years, if not decades, and wouldn't see each other until the end of the Berlin Wall. But the point is, because a wall was a hell of a lot better than a war, America will criticize the Soviet Union and they'll criticize the wall, but they won't do any concrete action. The fall of the wall in 1989 has no Western intervention, or at least no direct Western intervention at all. The president at the time, Ronald Reagan, will give a speech a couple of years before. But this was a spontaneous, it was an unplanned thing between East and West Berliners, which we'll go on to in a later lesson. So between 1961 and 1989, 5,000 people roughly crossed illegally. The vast majority are in the first few years before the defences are pretty reinforced, but some people will continue to do it, including one poor man who dies within a couple of weeks of the wall falling. So across that time, somewhere between 140 to 200 are killed trying to do so, and that doesn't count the many hundreds who are captured and then imprisoned because of their attempts to cross. Going on to the build-up to the Cuban Missiles Crisis, and you notice we've gone back in time because the Cuban Missiles Crisis and the Berlin Wall have several years of build-up before this. The first thing you need to remember is the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Before that revolution, when the government was replaced, we have this man, General Batista, in charge. He had been backed by the US as a capitalist, in massive quotation marks. Batista was not a pleasant man. He was not a good ruler of Cuba. He was exploitative, he was corrupt. Thousands of people died because they opposed his government, but the US backed him because it was either him or a communist. In any case, the US supplies and equipment and support were not enough, and after a 6-year-long civil war, Fidel Castro came into power. And you'll notice from his dates there, those are not his birth and death years, they are the years that he was the ruler of Cuba. So from 1959 up until 2011, he was the ruler of this country. Now, he's starting out being vaguely socialist. In a couple of years, he'll come out as out-and-out communist. But both of those terms are deeply scary to any average American in the Cold War. In particular, the idea that Castro would nationalize Cuban industries, in other words, take control of them from private hands, don't give them any money and run them for the people. It's a deep communist idea, and it's very scary to any American capitalist. So America obviously doesn't want to invade Cuba at this point. That will raise tensions and perhaps spark a response from the East or the Soviet Union. So they try to use their economic power. They block Cuban imports. In other words, if Cuba wants to sell something in America, the American government literally makes it illegal. Again, in particular, sugar exports, in other words, Cuba selling sugar, was a major part of their economy. It's one of the main reasons why they've been as successful as they had in the 1900s. But because those sugar exports were banned when they were being imported into America, Cuba's economy started to suffer. So Khrushchev and the Soviet Union step in and they will trade Cuban sugar for Soviet oil at discount rates. Without American intervention, Cuba's economy would have crashed. But because the Soviet Union stepped in, Khrushchev is essentially Superman for the Cuban people. This causes Khrushchev and Castro to become incredibly close. So the American decision to block Cuban imports was a massive own goal. This had been designed to wreck Cuba, but it simply meant that Cuba went from looking to America to looking to the Soviet Union. So when Kennedy became president in 1961, he was presented with a plan from the CIA. The CIA, if you're not sure, is the American equivalent of James Bond, this shadowy, secretive government organization which will look at other countries and try to carry out the things which are in America's interests. The CIA had proposed the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's called the Bay of Pigs because there is a particular area of Cuba on the southern coast called the Bay of Pigs. It called for 2,500 Cubans who had been kicked out of Cuba because they opposed Castro to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro's government. The idea of the Americans helping was supposed to be secretive, but the plan also called for American planes to bomb the Cuban air bases during the invasion. It was a ridiculous plan. Kennedy was kind of misled as to how successful it would be. He also changed a few things. The sum of it is, within 2 weeks, those Cuban exiles were either killed or detained. And worst of all for America, it was clear that the Americans had been involved. So by this point, Castro knows that the Americans are trying to remove him. The American government will spend decades either trying to assassinate him or remove him from power. So Castro needs some kind of protection. So his response was to ask Khrushchev for help. And Khrushchev will send help in the form of nuclear missiles. So those nuclear missiles could blow up most, if not almost all, of American cities. This is linked to the idea of mutually assured destruction. Neither side would use nuclear weapons out of the fear of the other side using them, and before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans already have nuclear weapons in Turkey, which, as you can see from that map, could blow up most of the important places in the Soviet Union, including Moscow, where Khrushchev lives. So this leads to the tensest 13 days of the entire Cold War. We've got three key events here. So on October 15th, a U-2 spy plane identifies those Soviet missiles. Kennedy's response is to create a blockade of US ships around Cuba. At this point, they don't realize that there's already so many Soviet missiles there. They want to prevent more, if not any, Soviet nuclear missiles from reaching Cuba. They thought there might be up to 100. There were actually 142, so they were an even bigger problem than they had previously thought. 10 days later, the Soviet ships finally arrive at the US blockade. Khrushchev had sent these to test the American nerve, and in particular, test Kennedy's ability to hold up under pressure. One of these ships had slipped through this blockade. It's called the Bucharest. Kennedy allows it, in quotation marks. He hadn't wanted it to actually go, but he realized it wasn't worth either blowing up or taking over the ship, particularly as it might not have held nuclear materials. In actual fact, it held nothing of nuclear or military worth. It had grain exports. So it would have been very bad for him to take over the ship, because again, Khrushchev could say America is stealing food from the Cubans. He'd be no better than Stalin in his Berlin blockade. A couple of days later, the US received two conflicting or disagreeing messages from the USSR to end the crisis. The first one said, "We will remove the missiles from Cuba if you publicly promise not to invade Cuba." The second one, on October 27th, says, "We will remove the missiles from Cuba if you remove the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey." Now, Kennedy does a mixture of these. He publicly promises not to invade Cuba, and he says, "We will secretly remove the missiles." In other words, we won't make it look like this was part of the plan. What Khrushchev and the Soviet Union didn't realize is that the Americans were going to remove the Jupiter missiles anyway because they were out of date. So Khrushchev thought he was getting an incredibly good deal, but in reality, the Americans were only promising to do two things they probably weren't going to do anyway. They probably were never going to invade Cuba, and they were definitely going to remove the Jupiter missiles. Moving on to the consequences of the Cuban Missiles Crisis. We might have the start of détente. We definitely have that by the 1970s, according to most historians, but some historians would argue that we have a relaxing of tensions right after the Cuban Missiles Crisis. That does kind of ignore the whole problem with the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, but we'll get there in one more slide. I've split up these 6 main consequences of the Cuban crisis into 3 themes, just like I have for the original lesson. So for Kennedy and Khrushchev, it's a very mixed bag. Kennedy is mostly praised for solving the crisis, but Khrushchev is mostly criticized in the East, both by the Soviet Union, so members of the Communist Party that he is a member of, by most people in Eastern Europe, and also by Mao Zedong, the leader of China. Within 2 years, in 1964, Khrushchev is replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who is a much more hardline communist. In fact, Brezhnev is one of the main reasons why Khrushchev was replaced in the first place. Looking at the military agreements between America and the Soviet Union, we've got the Partial Test Ban Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the Partial Test Ban Treaty just partially bans testing of nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was almost all countries with the ability to create nuclear weapons promising not to spread nuclear weapons. The only ones that don't sign are places like Israel or India or Pakistan, which may or may not have had nuclear weapons in a previous life. All countries also committed or promised to disarm all nuclear weapons at some point. That kind of leads on to the START talks and the START Treaty right at the end of the Cold War. More generally, between the two superpowers, they set up the hotline in 1963. Those two letters right at the end of the crisis have been very confusing. So the hotline is set up between Moscow and Washington for quick and relatively straightforward communication. And as another example of them working together with the Outer Space Treaty 1967. And again, almost all countries in the world agree to share space. So from 1967 onwards, it is illegal for any country to claim the moon or Saturn or any other body outside of Earth, which does mean that Neil Armstrong planting the flag on the moon is a little bit dubious, but they're not claiming it, it just looks like they are. They also promise not to put nuclear weapons in orbit. This doesn't prevent launching an ICBM from Earth, going into space and then landing in another place on Earth, but in order to keep it in orbit, which lowers Cold War tensions again. So going on to the Prague Spring and invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. We've got three main causes: poor living standards, discontent or unhappiness with communism. We've got the fact that communism tends to be quite repressive and not allowing people to do certain things. And we've got a new popular charismatic leader like Imre Nagy. Oh, hang on, this is a bit embarrassing, isn't it? I've got all things on Hungary 1956. No matter, let's fix that. The point is, the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the Czechoslovakian uprising of 1968 are caused by virtually the same sorts of things. It's simply the details which change. So rather than Rakshi and the ARVO, you've got Novotny and the STB. The Comecon for both Czechoslovakia and Hungary makes them focus on certain aspects of heavy industry. As a result, it's very difficult or very expensive to buy things like TVs or fridges or new fashionable clothes. And both times they have a new, popular or charismatic leader. Dubček in particular has a very important slogan. He promises socialism with a human face. Remember, in our course, socialism basically means the same thing as communism. His main point, just like Nagy, is that for communism to work, people need to want it. It's not enough to force communism on people, otherwise they'll always try to resist it. As to what socialism with a human face involves, it's the same sort of stuff that Nagy was promising in Hungary. Freedom of press, so newspapers can say what they want. Freedom of speech, so you can say what you want. You want some examples of capitalism. You want businesses to be allowed to run for personal profit. So if you work hard, you can become a millionaire. And both Nagy and Dubček wanted some other parties in elections. In other words, they wanted other socialist parties. So, for example, the British version of Labour would be allowed to run, perhaps, in either Czechoslovakia or Hungary, but the Conservatives wouldn't, because they're too right-wing, they're not left-wing enough. So in other words, Nagy and Dubček both want mostly communism, but with some capitalism and some democracy. One thing Dubček makes crystal clear, however, is that Czechoslovakia will not leave the Warsaw Pact. The only reason he said that was because he knows that Nagy promising for Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact was the trigger, it was the main reason why Khrushchev invaded Hungary. So he publicly said that Czechoslovakia will not leave the Warsaw Pact so that Brezhnev would not invade Czechoslovakia. Unfortunately, that did not work. So after a month of fighting and 500,000 Soviet troops along with Warsaw Pact troops, 6,000 tanks, they all invade Czechoslovakia within a matter of weeks, but very few Czechoslovaks are killed. The main reason for this is that Dubček publicly pleaded, he went on radio telling people not to resist. He had been trying to prevent a Warsaw Pact invasion, but as soon as it had started, he realised there's no point trying to resist. There's no point these Czechoslovaks throwing away their lives for no reason. Again, unlike Nagy, he was allowed to live. Nagy had been lied to, arrested and executed in Moscow. But Dubček will be alive to see the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. And in this lesson originally, I'd pointed out that even as communism failed in Czechoslovakia, Dubček was publicly calling for socialism with a human face. He was saying, well, look, we want communism, but a less or a more diluted version of communism. But that wasn't enough for people. They wanted full democracy and full capitalism. In terms of reactions, again, just like Hungary, the US and the West criticised but did not offer anything of substantial assistance. Mao Zedong, the leader of China, again criticised because he is still the leader of China at this point. He'll finally die in the early 1970s. This was the main reason, or at least a strong reason, why détente happened. Because China had, at this point, completely split from the Soviet Union. They were both communist, but they wanted their own paths. This worried the Soviet Union. It worried Brezhnev in particular. One final important consequence of the invasion of Czechoslovakia was the Brezhnev Doctrine. So the Brezhnev Doctrine says no country is allowed to leave the Warsaw Pact, but more importantly, no country was allowed to become less communist. In other words, Eastern European countries had to follow what the Soviet Union wanted communism to be. Because Dubček had not wanted to leave the Warsaw Pact, at least publicly, but he had wanted Czechoslovakia to become less communist. According to Brezhnev, this was completely unacceptable. So here we have another quick summary of topic 2 in 100 words or less. As in the previous summary video, I've color-coded them according to whether they're linked to the West specifically, the East specifically, or both.